In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. We continue our discussion of the introduction to the Gospel of Mark and move now to chapter 11, verses 27 to 33, which is a pericope about the authority of Jesus. The three groups which are mentioned here are the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. It seems to be the situation with regard to the cleansing of the temple. So when they ask Jesus about his authority, since in Matthew and in Luke, that is Matthew 21, 23 to 27, Luke 21 to 8, Jesus is teaching in those Gospels. So the question about authority could be linked in Matthew and Luke to his teaching. Here, we are told very clearly that Jesus is walking in the temple, and by saying in verse 27, again they came to Jerusalem, Mark seems to want to make a connection between the clearing of the temple and between this walking now. So the question of the authority of Jesus seems in the Gospel of Mark to be based on what Jesus has done rather than his teaching. However, we cannot be so specific to say that it refers to that alone. The link is clearer in Mark than in Matthew and Luke, so it could also refer to the entire teaching authority and the authority of Jesus as a rabbi. The connection, however, between the clearing of the temple and the question of authority is more linked in Mark than in Matthew and Luke. In response, Jesus asks also a question, and the question that he asks is about the baptism of John. Now, according to me, he is not trying to not answer, or he doesn't want to refuse an answer. He wants to check through their answer whether they will open to the revelation that God is making. You might remember in chapter 3, verses 22 to 30, when they accused him of being on the side of Beelzebul, he says there towards the end of that pericope, all sins, even against the Son of Man, can be forgiven. But anyone who sins against the Holy Spirit, that person cannot be forgiven. That person is guilty of an eternal sin. And Mark gives us an explanation by telling us this was because they said he has an evil spirit in him. So Jesus, through this question of John's baptism, wants to see if they are open, because very clearly the answer of Jesus, based on what he says here, the question he asks them here, is to say that he derived his authority from his baptism. And as readers of the Gospel of Mark, we are aware that it was at his baptism that the three events occurred, namely the rending open of the heavens, the Spirit coming on him, and the voice from heaven issuing an invitation. So according to my interpretation, Jesus is pointing back to his baptism as that foundational experience at which he got his authority. As a matter of fact, we know almost immediately after that, in chapter 1, verses 21 and 22, when Mark tells us about Jesus entering the synagogue and teaching, he says to us there that the authority of Jesus was not as their scribes. So the authority can be linked with the baptism experience which Jesus has. He is so sure, so convinced at that experience of what he is going to say. So it is his experience which makes him or allows him to preach. You might remember that in the structure which I propose of the Jerusalem section and the first chapter of that Jerusalem section, which was divided into 5 parts. The entry into Jerusalem was the first part. The exit from the temple was the last part. In between, we had the controversies. One, we have just seen the controversy about his authority. Later, after chapter 12, verses 1 to 12, we will hear about the controversies with regard to different other aspects, with regard, first of all, to the resurrection, and then later on with regard to the first commandment, and with regard to later on David's son. So in the center of that structure was what is termed variously as the parable of the vineyard, the parable of the murderous tenants, the parable of the tenants in the vineyard. I also said in an earlier lecture that this parable has been allegorized already in its telling. You may remember that when we were discussing the parable discourse of Mark in chapter 4, verses 1 to 34, I said at that time that the parable of the sower and the seed found in Mark 4, verses 3 to 9, is allegorized in Mark 4, verses 13 to 20. By that I meant each element in the parable is given a meaning. So the seed is the word of God. The path is this kind of reception to the word, and so on. Here, when Mark uses the term beloved son, which we have come across earlier in chapter 1, verse 11, and in chapter 9, verse 7, our minds automatically or naturally, to use another synonym of automatically, go back to Jesus. And that's why I say this parable seems to have been allegorized already in its telling. The parable begins by informing us that Jesus began to speak to them. The them refers to those who have questioned his authority. So you might say that this parable is also a sort of response to the question about his authority. In the Old Testament, the vineyard, according to Isaiah chapter 5, verse 2, is regarded as Israel. So God has tended Israel. Here, the owner of the vineyard is giving the vineyard in trust to different individuals. You can extend this interpretation to also speak about us being given the vineyard of the world or the earth in trust. And in a sense, what the tenants do seems to be what we as human beings have done to God's vineyard. We have taken charge of that vineyard and we have not given back to God what God's share of produce is. Now, the number of people whom the owner of the vineyard sends in order to collect the produce are dealt with differently and are dealt with in a more and more violent manner, so that the final one before the son is dealt with in the most violent manner, in that servant is killed. And so now the owner of the vineyard has one more person whom he can send, a beloved son. As I said, we came across this term from the voice from heaven, both at the baptism and at the transfiguration. So the owner of the vineyard seems confident that the son will be respected. However, they realize that because this is the heir, they know that if the heir is killed, then they can take over the vineyard. So what do they do in the Gospel of Mark? In the Gospel of Mark, they kill the son and throw him out of the vineyard. In Matthew and Luke, where this parable is also told, the order is different. They threw him out and killed him, which seems to be more historical when regarded with the death of Jesus. So you take Jesus out of the city, that is interpreted as throwing him and killing him there on the cross. So therefore, Calvary or Golgotha is outside the precincts of the city. So Matthew and Luke seem to chronologically have it correct. However, the possible reason why Mark seems to have killed him and threw him out of the vineyard is, according to me, because here too, Mark wants to show the total abandonment. No one except a stranger, Joseph of Arimathea, was there to bury Jesus. So in a sense, in 1451 and 52, Mark shows the abandonment by his disciples. In 1462 and 63, he shows the total condemnation by the entire Sanhedrin, including Joseph of Arimathea, because later in chapter 15, verses 40 to 47, when Mark speaks about the burial of Jesus, he will remind us that Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the council. And in 1462-63, he says very clearly, and they all condemned him as deserving death. That means Joseph also condemned him as deserving death. And therefore later, when he shows Joseph of Arimathea, once again he will tell us that he went to Pilate boldly. Only Mark uses this term. He went to Pilate boldly in order to ask for the body of Jesus so he could bury the body. The ending of the parable is supplied here in Mark by Jesus. In Matthew, where the parable is also told, it is the hearers who answer. And what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will take over the vineyard and give it to others. And the point which Jesus seems to be making in the telling of the parable in the Gospel of Mark is that the stone rejected, who is Jesus. And very clearly, we have seen, because of the growing opposition to Jesus, that he is indeed the stone rejected. Now, here is where once again I say that the parable has been allegorized in its telling. Namely, they realize here that the parable is told about them. And even though they want to arrest him, they feared the crowd, and so they let him go. According to the point of the gospel, you might interpret this as saying the hour had not yet come. Now, this parable, as we saw, is allegorized in its telling. So it seems that the evangelists have used these different servants who were sent and finally the beloved son, because they want to link it with what is going to happen to Jesus, and they also want to link it with who will do harm to Jesus. There are some who see the parable as parable. You might remember that when I talked about the parable of the sower and the seed, I said that the interpretation of the sower and the seed is that there are 4 types of soil, in which 3 types of soil there is loss. Only in 1 type of soil there is gain. 3/4 of the effort is lost, 1/4 is gain, and yet the gain in that 1/4 is 30, 60, 100. When we saw the allegorization, the interpretation was different. The questions asked in the allegorization is, what type of soil are you? Are you the soil which is along the path, and so therefore you're very frivolous in your response? Are you the soil among rocky ground where you do not have depth, among thorns where the cares of the world choke you, and so on? Now, some see this parable as parable. I'm going to give you 3 interpretations. The first is of John Dominic Crossan, who has written this book in parables, which I would suggest that you also read, because these are excellent scholars who give very, very good interpretations, which you can use even today. So when looked at as a parable and not linked with Jesus, not linked with the adversaries of Jesus, what would the parable mean according to John Dominic Crossan? He says, radical action. That means if you want to gain the kingdom, you must be willing to fight for what you want. This is therefore a very violent parable. And so according to John Dominic Crossan, basically you want something, you're going to do anything to get that thing. In Matthew chapter 13, Jesus speaks at the end of Matthew chapter 13, 2 parables about the treasure in the field and about the pearl of great price. The man who is in the field is not searching for the treasure, he finds it by accident. But what does the man who finds the treasure in the field do? He goes and sells everything he has. Now you might question, the man was not honest. If he found the treasure, he should have informed the owner of the field. Those questions the parable cannot answer. The parable is focusing on one point. And so this man is one pointed now. He has found the treasure and is going to do anything and everything in order to buy that field so he can take over that treasure. Similarly here, to be sure, it is very violent on the part of the tenants, and yet the point being made is not so much about the violence. As a matter of fact, in Luke chapter 16, verses 1 to 8, we are told the parable there of the dishonest steward. The steward was going to be thrown out of the employment because the master had found out that he was dishonest. This steward, because he is too ashamed to beg and because he is not strong enough to dig, what does he do? He calls his master's debtors one by one and lessens the debt. Now, you might question the integrity of the steward, but you cannot, because the steward was dishonest. So the focus in that parable is on the action of the steward. And my interpretation of the action of that steward there is preparation in the present for the future. The steward takes radical action. You might interpret it as dishonest action, which it is, but the steward is dishonest. The point is, he's not going to mourn his loss of employment. He's going to do something about it. So similarly here, the question is not to focus on the violent aspects, but to focus on the fact that these tenants are willing to do anything. Joachim Jeremiah's The Parables of Jesus is a classic which is written in the 70s, but I think still valid even today. According to Jeremiah, the kingdom will be taken from the false leadership who are identified with those tenants and given to repentant publicans and sinners. This is not so clear in the parable itself. It is clear in the lesson which Jesus supplies. So I am not really convinced about this explanation of Joachim Jeremias, because I think he is giving this interpretation also based on the response of Jesus. So Jesus answers the question, what will the owner of the vineyard do? Which according to me seems to be a later development. The parable, according to me, ends with the throwing of the son out of the vineyard. And so, another interpretation by J.R. Donahue, The Gospel in Parables, which is also a very good book. The interpretation is God keeps searching without giving up for rebellious humanity. God will send servants, and we have seen this honestly in the whole history of the Bible. When we look at the Bible, we can see it as God's search and constant search for us to come back to God. As a matter of fact, the letter to the Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 to 2, summarizes this very beautifully when it tells us, in many and various ways, God spoke of old through the prophets. So God is constantly speaking. But it goes on to say, in these last days, he has spoken to us through a son. So therefore, that is one interpretation also which you can take for your reflection. You can extend this interpretation to the situation in which we find ourselves today. God has given us this earth in trust. God has given us this earth to be caretakers. God has given us this earth because he expects us to give it back to God in a better manner than we found it when we came. But we have behaved like the tenants. We have abused it. We have done all kinds of damage to this world, and now we are challenged. The first of the controversies now, which appear in the fourth part of the structure, is with regard to taxes. The taxes here are a very controversial, or the tax here is a very controversial tax. It was known as the poll tax in English, or the census, the census tax. It was a head tax which had to be paid by every adult Jew when Judea became a Roman province under direct rule in 6 CE, that is the 6th of the Common Era. So it was a big challenge for the people to pay tax. The zealots would oppose the tax violently. The Pharisees opposed the tax and were not in favor of paying it, but they would not use violence. So here they possibly refers to the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders about whom the parable was told. Now they said Pharisees and Herodians. Why Pharisees and Herodians? Because it is a question of the law. Is it lawful to pay taxes? Should we pay them? Should we not pay them? And Herodians, because Herodians are meant to be partisans of Herod, and Herod was an ally of Rome. And so therefore they sent these two groups now to trap him. Now this group comes by trying to placate Jesus. They tried to put him on easy footing when they tried to boost him up. They tried to appeal to his ego. Now, the fact also is that what they say is true, but as we saw, and I mentioned this to you in Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 following, even though Jesus sees there or experiences there or hears there two kinds of responses to the healing of a deaf and dumb demoniac in 9:32 to 34 of Matthew, he is neither elated nor frustrated. He goes about doing what he has to do. So while on the one hand, what they say about Jesus is true, Jesus will not let that determine his answer. So they want to know about the law. Is it lawful according to what they would consider as the law of the Torah? Is it said in the Torah that we can pay these taxes? Should we pay them or should we not pay them? The word kenson, as I said, was a Latin loan word meaning census. So this referred to the head tax or the poll tax to be paid by every adult Jew. This hypocrisy is from hypocrisis, which means to wear a mask. So a person who is a hypocrite is someone who wears a mask. So knowing that they were coming there, not with their real faces, but with their masks in front of them. And so knowing in order to test him, Jesus identifies them and says, why are you putting me to the test? Now the response is to ask for a denarius. The denarius was a silver coin in Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16, a parable which we heard last week in the liturgy, will tell us that a denarius was a day's wage for a laborer. So they brought the denarius to Jesus. Now it is very interesting to note that in the precincts of the temple, where they would not have to have a coin with the Roman emperor's head on it, because when they offered in the temple, they would not offer Roman coins, they would offer Tyrian or Jewish coins. And that is why there were money changers there. The money changers would take outside the temple, they would take outside the main part of the temple, they would be sitting in the outer court, the court of the Gentiles, and taking denarii from individuals and giving them Tyrian or Jewish coins, which they could offer. There were three kinds of currencies there. One was the Greek currency, one was the denarius, and Roman currency, and the other was Jewish or Tyrian currency. So here, they seem to have it with them so easily. So already by asking them, it is very clear that Jesus does not seem to have a denarius, or at least if he had a denarius, we do not know. But by asking them, Mark is already trying to get us to see that they who should not have this Roman coin in the precinct of the temple have it with them. And then when they produce that denarius, the question of Jesus is about the icon or the image and the epigraphe, which would be translated as title or inscription. So the image is of the Roman emperor at that particular time, and the inscription would have been Tiberius Caesar Augustus, son of divine Augustus. So then, because the coin has the icon, the image of the emperor, and also has his inscription or title, it must be given back to him. However, very clearly, Jesus adds there to give back to God the things that are God's, which means the human person belongs to God. The human person, Genesis 1:26, is made in the image and likeness of God. And so, while things and taxes and money might be given to the Caesars of this world, to the emperors of this world, what is not to be given to the emperors of this world is human beings. Human beings belong to God. So the church, and we see that in the writings, in the letters, even in the New Testament, has always said that we as Christians, as believers in Jesus, must fulfill our civic responsibility. As a matter of fact, in the theme of the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 to 20, Jesus is explicit there when he says, I have come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. So civic responsibility is important. However, we need to stop with regard to civic responsibility. When it comes to civic responsibility, we don't need to go beyond that. We must be concerned citizens. We must be citizens who obey the law. We must try as far as possible to make sure that there is nothing lacking in our obedience of the law. And yet, we need to understand that the state, the government, the country is only a certain amount. We can give only a certain amount. We don't need to go beyond that. The next controversy is about the resurrection. Now, why did the Sadducees not believe in the resurrection? They did not believe in the resurrection because, according to them, there seems to be nothing in the Pentateuch which they accepted as their written scriptures. They would reject tradition or even later writings, including of Isaiah, and surely not of Daniel, which is much, much later than Isaiah, where there are texts which speak about the resurrection, at least giving a hint about the resurrection. They would not accept those. And so therefore, they come to Jesus very clearly. And we know that Paul had a similar challenge in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 23, verses 6 to 8, where Paul very cunningly and cleverly puts the Pharisees against the Sadducees. So the Pharisees had some vague concept of the resurrection. There was no theology of the resurrection as there is today after the resurrection of Jesus. So they had a vague idea, but they did believe in the resurrection. For the Sadducees, this life was all that you had. The Epicureans, you might remember, the Western philosophers, and the Charvakas, the Indian philosophers, had this understanding of life: eat, drink, and make merry, for tomorrow you die. They also, like the Sadducees, thought that this life was all that you had. So enjoy this life to the full. And then, what is interesting to note is this, that when we use the word enjoyment, unfortunately, we not only, but more often than not, interpret the word enjoyment as eating and drinking and having external pleasures. You can enjoy life even by reaching out to others. You can enjoy life by praying. You can enjoy life by giving to somebody the extra that you have. But notice, so a very narrow definition of enjoyment. So why? Those of us who might find it difficult to believe in the resurrection could even have this philosophy. I would say having this philosophy is not a problem. Having this philosophy and becoming selfish because of it is a problem. As a matter of fact, in chapter 13, which we will come to in a few moments, Jesus says, about that hour, you will not know, the angels will not know, even the Son will not know. That hour, that moment is known only to God. And so therefore, even if I were an Epicurean, even if I were a Charvaka, what I would do is I would live in the present moment to the best of my ability, in the best way I can, because it does not augur well to speculate about the resurrection. We can only speculate about the resurrection. We can only give theories about the resurrection. We cannot give facts about the resurrection, except about the resurrection of Jesus, which has been narrated to us. And so therefore, these Sadducees who say that life ends with death come with what might seem to be a very, very difficult situation to answer. The word Levi is the Latin for brother-in-law. And in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 to 6, there is what is known as the provision for levirate marriage. What is levirate marriage? What they state here. They state that if a person, a man, married a woman, And if the man died and left no children with that woman, then the brother had to marry the brother's wife. So the brother-in-law, the Levite, had to marry his brother's wife. And that is very clearly according to Deuteronomy. The brother-in-law had no choice in this regard. If he refused, then he would be insulted and treated almost as an outcast. So they don't go into those details of what would happen if a brother-in-law refused to marry his brother's wife. They talk about a situation where 7 brothers married the same woman. And so the question is, whose wife will she be? Now understand this. If the question is, whose wife will she be? They understand that the situation after death will be the same as the situation before death. And Jesus' understanding is quite different. The situation after death will be different from the situation before death. And Jesus answers this in 2 ways. First, he talks about the scriptures and then the power of God. However, in the explanation, he first takes on the power of God and then speaks about the scriptures. So what exactly is the point of the power of God? The power of God is this, that in the resurrection, an individual will be different from who he or she is in this life. As a matter of fact, in the second letter to the Corinthians, Paul gives a very beautiful analogy to explain this as much as it can be explained, to say, when you look at a seed and you put that seed into the ground, you get either a shrub, you get a plant, or you get a tree. Now you look at the tree, and what do you notice? The tree is different from the seed. As a matter of fact, sometimes you cannot even understand that it was this seed which was sown and this tree is a result of that seed. They seem so different. And so therefore, Paul gives that analogy to explain the resurrected body. Jesus, in this answer here in the Gospel of Mark, speaks about a different kind of body, what may be termed as an angelic body, but not only an angelic body, it is also an angelic relationship. Because in the kingdom, after the resurrection, there will be no question of being taken in marriage and given in marriage. The individuals will be like an angel, so that is not going to be an issue at all. The second part of the answer is based on scriptures. And the scripture which Jesus quotes is Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. Jesus refers to it as in the book of Moses, so that it was taken for granted that Moses wrote Exodus. And in the story about the bush, they would not refer to it in those days as we would refer to it with chapter and verse. So the story about the bush is Moses encountering God in the burning bush. And when Moses encountered God and God revealed God to Moses, Moses said there, or rather God said there, I am. Which means, first of all, a God of the present. And this phrase, to define God, is for me a very, very important phrase, not only theologically, but also philosophically. And I say philosophically because we as human beings are what we would call chronological creatures. That is, we have come at a moment in time and we will go at a moment in time. That is, I was born in a particular year, I was a child in a particular year, I was a youth or I was youth in particular years, I became an adult after a number of years, and so on. So this is by chronology. For God, there is no chronology. There is only kairos. That is, there is only the eternal present. God is present. So God never was and God never will be, but God is. And that's why in the revelation which God makes to Moses in Exodus 3:14, when Moses asks for God's name, God says there, tell them I am who am. That is, I was not, nor will I be, but I am. And so therefore, Jesus shows them through the scriptures which they would accept, because Exodus would be a book which they accepted, that God is and continues to be a God of Abraham, a God of Isaac, and a God of Jacob. And if they were not alive with him, God would not mention that he was their God. God mentioned that he's their God because they are alive with him. The next controversy actually is not so much a controversy, because this scribe here is a scribe who is positively disposed towards Jesus. He hears that that Jesus answered them well, and so he comes as a searcher, as a seeker, because later on at the end of the very quote, Jesus will commend him. He comes as a genuine seeker and asks, which is the commandment is first of all. He is talking about the commandment in order of priority. And the reason why this question would have been a valid question would be because there were 613 commandments and precepts. Of these, 248 were positive and 365 were prohibitions. So of these now, which one is the first? Jesus quotes Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 5, part of the Decalogue. The first is, "Hear, O Israel, Shema, O Israel. The Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with everything, and with all your strength." So the Markan Jesus responds to the scribe by presenting, notice, as the first commandment, a citation of Deuteronomy. Now, nowhere is the connection with Jesus makes here made before Jesus. Notice Leviticus 19:18 is quite a different text, and yet here Jesus brings up that text and links it up. We see the second is this, but the scribe would have said, "I never asked you about the second. I asked you only about the first." And yet Jesus will not stop only with the first. He will continue with the second, because as far as Jesus is concerned, the second is not really the second. The second and the first must be read together. As a matter of fact, very clearly in his letter, first letter of John, chapter 4, verse 20, John, because of his experience with Jesus, possibly writes there, "If anyone says that they love God, but cannot love their brother or sister," John will use a very, very strong term, "they are liars." Because how can you say that you love God whom you cannot see, and love your brother, or not love your brother or sister whom you can see? So the linking up is unique to Jesus. To be sure, other rabbis also spoke about not doing to others. For example, the golden rule in Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, which is talked about by different rabbis at the time of Jesus, that is not doing to others what you would not want to do to yourself, or doing to others only what you would want to do to yourself. However, the linking up of the love of neighbor and making it on par with the love of God is unique. So the love command, the scribe replies, is much more than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. As a matter of fact, we know that in the Sermon on the Mount, we are told that if there is something which we have against a brother or sister, and we are offering a sacrifice, we need to leave that sacrifice and then go and reconcile and then come back and offer. So Jesus is also positively disposed to this scribe. So we notice the openness on the part of an individual will decide how much that individual accepts. In chapter 4, we saw about in chapter 4, 21 to 25, we were told about the lamp and the measure. The measure there was referred to the openness which an individual receives. The measure with which one is open will be the measure that one will receive. And that's why here, this scribe is open, and Jesus says, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And after that, no one dared to ask him any question. That is why the next question will be asked by Jesus himself. The time is 9:45. You can take a break and come back at 9:55. I hope everybody is here who's meant to be here. Okay, I'm going to continue now. The next text or pericope is taken up by Jesus himself and by asking a question. So Jesus continues to be in the temple, and Mark says here, while Jesus was teaching in the temple, he said, how can the scribes say that the Messiah is son of David? Now the question of son of David, and as we have seen in Matthew's genealogy, chapter 1 of the Gospel of Matthew, verses 1 to 18, was a very, very important question. Even mentioned in John chapter 7, verses 41 to 42, when they were discussing the identity of Jesus, they asked, is not the Messiah to come from the Davidic lineage? And so this question was a very, very important question. However, Jesus, the marking Jesus wants to indicate that while Jesus may be from the lineage of David, he is not merely from the lineage of David, he goes beyond that. And how does Jesus show that? The Psalms, or Psalm 110, was attributed to Moses. Now, Moses is singing this psalm. And as David, were attributed to David. David is singing the psalm, and in his singing the psalm, David is saying, the Lord, that is God, said to my Lord, that is the Messiah. Now, if David singing the psalm says that God said to the Messiah, whom David considers as his Lord, then it means that the Messiah is not merely son of David. He is son of David because he is from the lineage of David. So from physical lineage of David, yes, but he is David's Lord. So very clearly, while you might say that the Messiah has come from the line of David, David is the Messiah's ancestor physically from the genealogical point of view. The Messiah is actually David's Lord. And why is he David's Lord? Because David himself speaks about the Messiah as being his Lord. The end of this particular section begins with a comparison of scribes and widows. 4 aspects of the scribes' desire are mentioned. First, they like to walk around in long robes. Second, they like to be greeted with respect. Third, they like the best seats in the synagogue and places of honor at the banquets. So these actually are very, very harsh against widows. In the Old Testament, on many occasions, widows and orphans were considered as specially under God's protection. Orphans because they had no adult to look after them, and widows because they would often not have a male member to support them or to be of help to them. And that's why this is a very strong condemnation, because widows did not have sometimes a male member in the family. They might not have had a son, they may have had only daughters. They could be easily fooled and taken for a ride. So therefore, Jesus is speaking about the various ways, possibly, he doesn't mention explicitly, but the devouring of widows' houses could mean their entire property. They could be fooling them with regard to legal fees. They could be fooling them as with regard to court cases and doing a number of other things there. So this is basically Jesus condemnation against the widow, against the scribes. The mention of widows possibly made Mark bring the next pericope in this connection. So Jesus is sitting opposite the treasury. Now, this position opposite the treasury is on the one level to show that he can watch what is happening in the treasury, but can also mean that he is against what is happening. So his position is opposite. We saw earlier on when Jesus is inside the house, the adversaries, including family members, are outside the house. So the physical position also determines the person's theological position. Later on, we will go and Mark will tell us in chapter 13, Jesus went and sat on the Mount of Olives, which Mark will insist is opposite the temple. So the position there of Jesus is the opposite of that of the temple. Here, the position of Jesus is opposite what is happening in the treasury, namely the requirement for funds. Now, while on the one level, funds are required for the upkeep of the temple and for other things like sacrifices and other expenses, without a doubt. That is not so much the challenge or not so much the problem. The problem is, according to me and some interpreters, that the scribes and the religious authorities of that time were putting guilt into the minds of people. As a matter of fact, even today, among so many Christians, there is this understanding of tithe. Tithe basically means 1/10. And so there are many people who feel that they are obliged to put into the collection box 1/10 of their earnings. Nowhere in the New Testament is this mentioned. It is an Old Testament, and at that time, particular time, the focus was so that one is not selfish, so that what one gives to the temple can be distributed among the poor. That was the requirement. But in the New Testament, there is no question of tithe at all. And yet, so often in the church, we have tried to provoke the guilt of people because of which they have been contributing. Or we have tried to preach what is known as the prosperity gospel, namely, the more you give God, the more God will give you. So there are a variety of means that sometimes we have used in the past to draw people to give. So according to this interpretation, this is what the religious leaders of that time also did, and especially with the poor. They were telling them that if you give now, then God will give you later. So in a sense, almost forcing them to put. And that's what, according to me, is upsetting Jesus. So the religious establishment, in its proclamation of who God is, has a tremendous responsibility. And the responsibility that it has, according to me, is to communicate to people, at least as Jesus has communicated, that an individual need do nothing in order to gain God's favor, because God's favor has already been gained. An individual needs only to respond because God's favor has been gained, because God's love has been received, because God's mercy has been received, because God's pardon and forgiveness has been received. One response. So Jesus sees this woman, and possibly this woman has been indoctrinated to be forced to give. And this, according to me, is what Jesus seems to be against. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance. She would have bought just a handful of flour with the 2 lepta, translated in English as copper coins, that she put in. But even that, she has in a way been forced, you might say, to give. She has been taught and encouraged by the religious leaders to donate as she does so, Jesus, according to one interpretation, is condemning the value system that motivates her action. The second chapter of the Galilee, of the Jerusalem section, is the eschatological discourse. The English word eschatological comes from the Greek eschaton, which means the last things, the things of the afterlife, the things which will happen after death. In chapter 13, verses 1 to 37, Mark's eschatological discourse, and found also in the Gospel of Matthew, very, very elaborate, made up of 2 chapters, beginning in chapter 24, verse 1, and ending in chapter 26, verse 1, also found in Luke, chapter 20 and 21. Here, in the Gospel of Mark, there is one chapter of the eschatological discourse. And so the eschatological discourse begins by Jesus predicting the temple's destruction in verses 1 and 2. Now, Jesus leaves the temple definitively. He will not enter the temple again after chapter 13 now. And so Mark begins by telling us, as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, the disciple is pointing out to the physical splendor, what large buildings. Then Jesus asked him, do you see these buildings? Of course, we see the buildings. And Jesus says, not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. Now, this is a sort of prediction about the destruction of the temple, which, as we know, happened in 70 CE. But because the interpretation, or rather because the sentence is not very clear, the prediction is not very clear as to how exactly this would happen, this is one reason why scholars date the Gospel of Mark before the destruction of the temple, before 70 CE. In Matthew 22:7, in the parable of the king who was giving a banquet for his son and invited people who did not come, the king then sends his troops to burn their city. Many scholars see that reference to burning the city as a reference to the Jerusalem temple being burned to the ground, because this is exactly what the Romans did. And because it was burned to the ground, scholars are of the opinion that Matthew wrote after the destruction of the temple to be so specific about its destruction, namely, it was destroyed by fire, by being burned. The market reference to the destruction is not as clear as in the case of Matthew, and therefore they date Mark before 70 CE, before the destruction of the temple. And then Jesus is sitting now on the Mount of Olives, and Mark will tell us the Mount of Olives is opposite the temple. So when Mark says it is opposite the temple, Mark is also telling us the theological position of Jesus. For the first time in chapter 13, verse 3, is Andrew mentioned along with Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John, we saw, were taken by Jesus into the house of Jairus when he raised Jairus' daughter in chapter 5, verses 35 to 43. They were taken for the second time in chapter 9, verses 2 to 9, that is the transfiguration. They will be taken for the third time in chapter 14, verses 32 to 42. Here, they are mentioned along with Andrew. The fourth person is mentioned, and these, we will remember, are the first 4 disciples who were called. They asked him privately. What did they ask him? They asked him to tell them when this will be? And second, they asked him, what will be the sign that all these things are to be accomplished? Jesus answers them. He answers both the questions, however. First, he answers things that will not be the signs, and then he speaks about things that will be the sign, and then only God knows. So when will this thing happen? The A question which they ask, when will this take place? When will all this be? He says only God knows when. And what will be the signs? First, Jesus says the things which are not the signs, and then later on he speaks about the things that are indeed the sign. So the question is, what are the things which are not the sign? Jesus explains. First of all, be very, very aware of being deceived. No one must lead you astray. Many will come in my name and say that I am he. And then there's another mention about being deceived in chapter 13, verses 21 to 33. If anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or look, there is the Messiah, do not believe it. In his first letter, John speaks about the Antichrist. Here, Mark has got the term false messiahs and false prophets will appear and produce signs and omens to lead you astray. Be alert. I have told you everything. So Jesus has already warned against deception. Future events which will take place and which are not really the sign. What are those future events? Wars, rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, kingdom rising against kingdom, earthquakes and famines. But this is only the beginning of the birth pangs. Later on, Jesus continues, when you see the desolating sacrilege, that is when you see Caligula try to put up his image, then each one must be ready at that time. And he says it's going to be a very, very challenging time. So we need to pray that it will not happen when we cannot really endure it. And even here, just as in Matthew's mission discourse, Matthew speaks about being betrayed by one's own family members. Jesus also speaks about the fact that those of the family who are not able to accept what Jesus is saying will be the ones who will betray. But what is the only reliable sign? In those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. However, then in verse 26 of chapter 13, then they will see the Son of Man. So here, the Son of Man comes in glory. The Son of Man comes in the clouds with great power and glory, and will send the angels and gather the elect from the forward. So you notice the reason why the Son of Man is coming is not to scatter. The reason why the Son of Man is coming is to gather. So we can already see the disposition of the Son of Man is coming to gather rather than to scatter, and that's why we do not need to be afraid. The parable which speaks about only God knows when is the parable of the fig tree. What is the parable of the fig tree saying in verses 28 and 29? When you look at the fig tree, you know that soon when the branches become tender, that summer is near. You can read the sign of the times. So when you see these things are happening, know that he is very, very close. He is at the gate. The parable which ends the eschatological discourse is a parable which speaks about constant watchfulness. And this parable speaks about the fact that the slaves are put in charge by the man who is going on a journey. And each one is given his or her job to do. I must do the job given to me. I must do what I am doing. The motto of the Jesuit Saint John Berchmans, who is the patron of altar servers, was in 3 Latin words, Arge quod agis. Do what you are doing. So this, I think, parable summarizes, or rather John's motto summarizes this parable. A man goes on a journey and puts his slaves in charge, each one with their own job. Therefore, keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight or at cockcrow or at dawn. 4 times are given to indicate the uncertainty of the Son of Man coming, the master of the house coming. And then in verses 30 to 32, for those who want to speculate, very clearly an amen saying is used, amen lego humin, translated as truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. So there is sure, you do not know, the angels do not know, even the Son of Man does not know. But who knows? Only God. And therefore, our job is to do what we have to do. This structure is taken from Sharon Dowd, a book written in 2000, Reading Mark. And the reason why I took this structure, because it seems to me that it explains very, very beautifully what exactly the eschatological discourse is about. And so this is the eschatological discourse. We can move on now to chapter 14, which is the last part of the Galilee section. In chapter 14 and 15, we will read what is known as the Passion narrative of the Gospel of Mark. Already at the beginning of the Passion narrative, there is what may be termed as a sandwich construction. And this sandwich construction has on either side the plot to kill Jesus, the chief priest on one side, and Judas providing the answer, and in between, a woman anointing Jesus. So what Mark is trying to indicate to us through this sandwich construction is that the religious leaders represented by the chief priests and the disciples represented by Judas are unaware of who Jesus is, though they are the ones who have to know. A woman, unnamed, the woman is not named. And we need to keep in mind about identifying the woman with Mary in the Gospel of Mark. No, she is unnamed in the Gospel of Mark and Matthew. Also, we need to not mix up the anointings. In the Gospel of Mark and Matthew, she anoints his feet, and the anointing is closer to the end of the Gospel, so it is regarded as an anointing. She anoints his head. She anoints his head because she anoints his head in preparation for the burial, what Jesus will say. In the Gospel of Luke, it is within the ministry of Jesus, Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to 50. It is within the ministry, and she anoints his feet. She is named a sinner there. She is not named a sinner in Mark or in Matthew. She is called a sinner only in Luke. In the Gospel of John, chapter 12, verses 1 to 12, the one who anoints, and there also the head of Jesus is anointed. The one who anoints Jesus there is called Mary, the sister of Lazarus. Again, the feet are anointed in the Gospel of John. So in 2 Gospels, John and Luke, it is the feet of Jesus which are anointed. In Matthew and Mark, it is the head of Jesus anointed. In John, it is close to the end of the gospel, because we know that chapter 13 of the Gospel of John, where the washing of the feet begins almost the end. You can see a long passion narrative beginning from 13 up to the end of chapter 19 in the Gospel of John. So you might say it is closer, very close to the passion narrative in the Gospel of John, which is in chapter 12. In Luke alone, it is within the ministry of Jesus. And so it was 2 days before the Passover and unleavened bread. These feasts, which was separate originally, were by the time of Jesus linked together. So it was a 7 or 8 day festival, both the Passover celebrated for 2 days and then a 6 day or 7 day feast of the unleavened bread. So the anointing at Bethany basically is in the house of Simon the leper. The woman comes with a jar of very, very costly ointment, and Mark will tell us of spikenard. Nard. So this was made of spikenard, nard, and so it would have been very, very expensive. She now anoints the head of Jesus. Literally what she does is she breaks the flask. In other words, she doesn't simply remove the lid, she breaks the flask. That is, the top part of the bottle was broken. Once the top part is broken, you cannot put any lid over that again. So very clearly the breaking of the flask indicates that she wants to use the entire perfume which is inside that jar. She wants to leave nothing. She wants to give everything as far as she's concerned to Jesus. This is basically the whole idea of breaking the jar, so it becomes unusable again. Nobody can use it. It will all be used as far as she's concerned for Jesus. There was some. Now, Mark, who does not give us who exactly it was, because Mark uses the word tines. Tines means son. In Luke, because it is within the ministry of Jesus, Simon the host is the one who makes the complaint and thinking to himself that the woman is a sinner. How can Jesus allow this sinner woman to touch him? In Matthew, the whole of the disciples as a group, they make the objection. In John, because John speaks about the money bag, etc., it is Judas. But Mark doesn't tell us who it was who made the objection. Some could possibly refer to the disciples and even others who may have been invited. The basis of their anger, or the reason why they scolded the woman, is because they think the money could have used in a better way. As a matter of fact, when they scolded her, they are thinking that this money could be given to the poor. Because of this mention of the poor, Jesus responds about what exactly this service is. In the Gospel of Mark alone, Jesus is given a very, very hurried burial. In John, he's given a royal burial, and in the other synoptics, that is in Matthew and Luke, he's given a burial in which you could see it as following the Jewish burial customs. However, in the Gospel of Mark, it seems that even the custom was not followed, because Mark does not make any mention of Joseph of Arimathea anointing the body before burial, which was a requirement. And so therefore, when Mark tells us here that Jesus identifies this with his death, he's saying there, she has performed a good service for me. So she has performed, you might even interpret it as a religious service for me, because she has anointed his body before death. Care for the poor is a regular obligation, and that must be done, and that can be done. However, this particular moment must be seen in its own light. Now, the phrase of Jesus, you will have the poor with you always, must not and cannot be interpreted as some unfortunately do, to imagine that Jesus is propagating or perpetuating poverty. That Jesus is saying the poor will always be poor, and don't worry about them. No, the focus is not so much the poor. The poor are introduced only because the disciples say that the money could have been given to the poor. The focus is this particular moment, and the reference to the poor must be seen in that light. The woman has done a religious service. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. So this is also termed by some as a passion prevention. And you could see it in that light. So Jesus is already interpreting that this particular action is a preparation. And some like to think that the reason why Mark has Jesus say that is to avoid any kind of problem later on with the fact that the body of Jesus was not anointed. If the woman is anointing it here and Jesus interprets this anointing as the anointing of his body before the event can occur, it is an indication that his body was indeed anointed. So therefore, what is the focus is the woman has insight, but the religious leaders and even the disciples are not able to have that. And that's why, once again, to an amen saying, when the gospel, the good news is proclaimed, Jesus sees his death here as not the end. When he talked about the good news is proclaimed, what is the good news? Later on, we saw in the first verse of the gospel, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. So what is that good news? We will see that good news in chapter 16, verse 7, when the young man, the Neaniscos at the tomb says, he's not here, he is risen. So therefore, when that good news is proclaimed, then what she has done will be said. So Jesus is linking up the proclamation of his resurrection with the action of the unnamed woman who anoints his body even before his death. Judas Iscariot, one of the 12. So already in chapter 3, verse 19, you might remember, that when naming the 12, Mark had told us there, and let the cat out of the bag, you might say, I told us that Judas Iscariot who betrayed him. Now that paradidomi, that handing over, that betrayal, that delivering up is shown here in its tangible form. How did Judas betray? He went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. Why did he go to the chief priests? Because they were plotting about the death of Jesus and they promised to give him money. So Mark does not have any details about the money. Matthew 26:50 is the only evangelist who mentioned 30 pieces of silver. John will tell us that Judas was in charge of the money bag, and they will give other reasons. However, my interpretation of Judas' action is this. Judas did not know where his authority ended. Judas wanted Jesus, like Peter and the others, to be a certain kind of Messiah. However, Jesus said to them, like he told Peter, you need to be a follower, not a leader. You need to be on God's side, not on human side. When he sat with his disciples and talked to them about being first and last, so constantly Jesus would talk about his way. And Judas, one of the 12, was unable to accept that way. So it is also likely, though the texts do not say it, it's also likely that Judas, seeing the power of Jesus, would have thought that if Jesus had his back against the wall, like he would have had his back against the wall, if Judas were to betray him, then Jesus would show his power, and in that particular emergency moment would be the kind of Messiah which Judas wanted him to be. And that's by reason for Judas betraying Jesus. So on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples come to Jesus and ask, where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? So very clearly what Mark is saying is that this Passover is a preparation where the Lord, where Jesus will be the host. So he will prepare, he will be in a way the host, the one who is hosting the Passover. You might remember also in chapter 11, verse 1. He sent two of his disciples then. He also sends two of his disciples now. And again, like in that instance, you might remember, it seemed that he had made arrangements in advance. They would see a man who was carrying a jar of water. And the reason why they would be able to identify that man is because usually jars were carried by women, and if men carried water, they would carry them in skins. So the fact that there is a man carrying a jar would be quite unusual in that village, and so they would be able to identify him. So Jesus comes because the Passover had to be eaten towards night. So Mark's mentioned it was evening to be interpreted as close to night. And unlike in the other Gospels, where Jesus is very specific about who exactly the betrayer is, this is not so in Mark. However, again to an amen saying, lego humin, amen, lego humin, very clearly Jesus is saying that one of them is going to betray him. Because of this statement of Jesus, they began to be distressed and ask one another. Now, the fact that they can ask one another is an indication also of their own weakness. And I think this is a nice understanding in a way of each of the disciples and even of us. Each one of us also, and on many occasions, have been betrayers and have been deniers. So they are asking one another because none of us really can be sure about whether we will be faithful to the end. So that's why in some cases we are called, Christians are called the pilgrim people. In chapter 3 of the letter to the Philippians, verses 7 to 14, Paul will say, not that I have already obtained it or am perfect, but one thing I do, I keep striving. So the question here of the disciples, surely not I, could be interpreted in that context. That means any one of them is aware that they could be deniers, they could be betrayers. The Son of Man goes as it is written for him. Now, this phrase sometimes has troubled people, where Jesus says it would have been better for that one not to have been born. What is the meaning of this? The meaning is that each one of us has to accept responsibility for our actions because we are born. We cannot pass the buck. We cannot put the blame on someone else. Because we are born, we say a particular word, we perform a particular action, and you have to accept responsibility for that action. This is how I interpret this. If the person were not born, then there's no question of you making a decision like this. So free will is what is of prime importance in this particular context. God leaves the individual free. The individual has to decide how he or she wants to act. And yet, after the individual has acted, he or she must also accept responsibility for the action. This is the meaning. It were better for that person if he had not been born, because then he would not have had to accept responsibility. In the Gospel of Mark, there is no specific command to eat or to drink. And that is why we need to be very, very careful about being absolute about the Eucharist. The Eucharist is a sacrament. The Eucharist is a thanksgiving. And we notice He took a bread and notice he blesses just like he did in the first feeding, chapter 6, verses 35 to 44. He said the blessing again. It is only over the cup that he gives thanks. And notice the translation is cup. It's not chalice as the new translation has, because basically they would drink from cups. The chalice is an introduction of the church as the church continued to move on. But it's a cup, it's a wooden cup which they would drink from. So that's why we need to be very, very careful about being absolute about some of these things. Nothing is absolute, keep in mind, except God. As a matter of fact, drink all of you is not mentioned at all. And all of them drank from it only with regard to the cup, that's all. This is my body. We're not told that they ate of the body. We're not told that. So the point is, we need to go beyond the mere words. We need to go to the meaning, and we do not need to get stuck up with the words. As a matter of fact, you know, if you don't know, I'm telling you now, in the Gospel of Luke, there are 2 cups. There's only 1 cup, there's bread, and then there's the second cup. So therefore, the understanding of the Passover is not 100%. Our understanding today of what exactly happened at the Passover is not 100%. And therefore, we need to go beyond the words. We need to go to the meaning. And so therefore, keep in mind, Mark's is the shortest, and these words are took, blessed, broke, and gave. These, if you remember, are also words which Mark used in the feeding miracle. There is no explicit command to eat and to drink. Notice they all drank from it, but Jesus doesn't tell them, you must eat it, no. You must drink it, no. They drank from it, that's another story. So the focus of Mark, and I would say the focus even of the other evangelists, as we would have seen if I was doing Matthew or Luke with you, the focus falls not on the words, but on the symbolism of the dead. Now, Hooper Polon, and this is also another of my challenges with for many. You notice it is true. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. The word is Hooper Polon, which is for many. However, it is for many as opposed to for few. It's not only for a limited people. This is how Hooper Polon must be interpreted in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 12, where this phrase is used in the Septuagint. You will read there that the sins of many will be forgiven. The sin, that means not a small select group. So there you can interpret, and this phrase is from there, must be interpreted in the sense for everyone. However, in the new translation, still the cup is shed and the blood is shed only for many. And some people unfortunately understand many to mean that others are excluded. I would not like to think that the Lord would make an exclusion of people, as we have seen the mark in Jesus. We have seen that whoever is not against us is for us. Do not stop him. If no one who uses my name will be able to talk ill about me. So that all drank from this cup would indicate that Judas also drank from the cup, and so therefore will make the betrayal even stronger. When Jesus drinks wine again, it will be in the resurrection, where he is indeed the Lord. They sing the hymn. They go to the Mount of Olives. And what hymn would they have sung? It would be the psalm which was sung, the psalms sung at the Passover, what is known as the Hallel or the praise songs. Hallelujah. Hallelujah means praise God, praise Yahweh. So the Hallel psalms are psalms of praise. And this is what they would have sung after they had had their supper. And then once again, because Jesus doesn't single Judas out, he talks about the betrayal now based on Peter's response. You will all become deserters. But notice this promise, you might say, in chapter 14, verse 28. I will remind you once again about it in chapter 16, verse 7. The promise with Jesus, the historical Jesus, the human Jesus makes to the disciples that he will go before them to Galilee. Peter objects, and Jesus responds by telling him that before, notice only Mark has got before the cock crows twice. In the Gospel of Matthew, it is before the cock even crows, not only twice, but before the cock crows. Luke says the cock will not crow this day, and even John before the cock crows. Notice, but before the cock crows twice. So that means after the first cock crow, Mark will remind us that when the cock crows the second time, Mark will remind us. So it's only in Mark that the cock crows twice before Peter will deny Jesus 3 times. Each one denies it. And Peter's objection here, even though I must die with you, is an indication that slowly we are beginning to understand who Jesus is and what he is about. Okay, brothers and sisters, the Passion narrative continues after the Passover supper and after the singing of the hymns, when they go to a place called Gethsemane. Now, this place, Gethsemane, seemed to be a place where Jesus would often go with his disciples, and that is why Judas seemed to know the place. Unlike John, who tells us very specifically that Judas went out and adds there, and it was night, to show that Judas has gone away from the light into the darkness. The other evangelists do not tell us when Judas left. And so therefore, when Jesus says here to his disciples, it is likely that Judas may have been with them or may already have gone. Now notice there are two groups which we can find here. First, these disciples are told, sit here while I pray. So they are kept some distance away. Now, of these 9, if Judas was present, or of these 8, for example, they are left here. And then of the total 12, he takes with him Peter, James, and John. So this is they are the 3 whom he has taken with him again and again. He takes with him Peter, James, and John, and we know they are taken now for the 3rd time. Now, it is to these 3 who we can envision are some way away from the other 8 or 9 that Jesus says, I am deeply grieved even to death. Translated in our language, it would be, I am terrified. And what does he ask them to do? He doesn't ask them to support him emotionally or spiritually. He simply says, remain here and keep awake. And this keeping awake is likely in order that he could not be disturbed, or he would not be disturbed when the arresting party came. That's why he wanted them to be awake. He doesn't even ask them to pray with him. He doesn't ask them to accompany him to pray, and then going a little farther. So we can see that there are possibly 2 groups and Jesus. One group is a little distance away, the 9 or the 8, if Judas has left, the 3 who are a little away from Jesus. And Luke, in order to indicate that he did not go very far away from them, uses the phrase a stone's throw. So not very far from the 3. And so therefore the 3 are left in a particular place and Jesus goes above. Now he throws himself on the ground. The usual posture for prayer would be either standing or kneeling. Throwing himself on the ground indicates very great agitation. And then he prepares for his prayer. He prays that if it were possible, the hour might pass him by. The hour here, the hora, refers to the hour of suffering, refers to the hour of the death. This hour might pass him by. And then what does he do? He prays. He uses two terms, one in Aramaic, the spoken language possibly of Jesus, and one in Greek, Abba Pater. This Abba Pater indicates intimacy as far as God and Jesus are concerned. And then he tells God who exactly God is, namely God is all powerful. God is almighty, because everything, all things are possible for God. And then he places his intention, remove this cup from me. He wants the cup to be removed. He doesn't want to drink the cup of suffering. He doesn't want to drink the cup of death. And yet, despite that, he adds, not what I want, but what you want. So in other words, God's will is primary. In chapter 3, verses 31 to 35, he had identified his true family as those who do God's will. Here, he shows what that means. The disciples are asleep. So Jesus goes away a second time and he prays, and he came back a third time. Notice, he came a third time. Matthew shows Jesus praying like the pious Jew of that time 3 times. Mark does not show Jesus praying 3 times. He says Jesus came a third time. So coming a third time would be indicative of the fact that as far as Mark is concerned, Jesus prayed 3 times. So he prays like the pious Jew. He prays 3 times. And so therefore, the prayer of Jesus in Gethsemane is a very, very important prayer. And we need to understand that basically, as far as Jesus is concerned, he is frightened, he is terrified, and he is going to his death. Immediately, while he was still speaking, what happens is this: the arresting party comes. Judas and Mark will remind us once again that he is one of the 12 arrive. They come with swords and clubs, and we know whom they come from. Now, very clearly you can see here that Judas kisses Jesus. So Judas came to Jesus and kissed him. And the question is, what does Jesus say to Judas in the Gospel of Mark? Notice, he says nothing. There is nothing here. There is no response of Jesus after Judas kisses him. Then there is a fight. There is a fight where the slave of the high priest's ear is cut off. Notice, they cut off his ear. Who was that who cut off the slave's ear? We are not told who. One of those who stood near. Could it have been a disciple? We do not know from the Gospel of Mark. Only one of those. And we understand, basically, that John gives us the name. Peter, Simon Peter drew his sword and cut up the high priest's slave's right ear. Luke also says right ear, but Luke does not give us the name. Matthew does not tell us which ear. Mark does not tell us which ear. In Mark, it seems that it could be one of the bystanders. In Matthew, it could be one of the disciples. But in Mark, it is one of those. Jesus, once again, makes no response after the ear is cut. In Matthew, he will say, put your sword back in its sheath. Do you not think I can ask the Father and he will send 12 legions of angels? In Luke, he says, no more of this, and heals the man's ear. In John, he says, put your sword back in its scabbard. Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me? But in Mark, he says nothing except to ask if they have come to arrest a bandit. And then the last words of Jesus in the garden are, let the scriptures be fulfilled. What does it mean? It means let God's will be done. And then, to show the total abandonment, Mark will tell us, all of them deserted him and fled. So Mark shows through this the total abandonment of Jesus, and then through this incident of the young man, who was following him possibly had come out to see what the situation was, he leaves even the loincloth. We remember that when Peter said in chapter 10, verse 28, that they had left everything to follow him, now they leave everything to run away from him. Jesus is now before the Sanhedrin, and Mark has placed this also in a sandwich construction. The reason for this sandwich construction is to show the fidelity of Jesus when contrasted with the infidelity of Peter. And so, as far as Mark is concerned, the chief priest, notice, and the whole council. So remember later on when he will tell us that Joseph of Arimathea was a respected member of the council. And here, when he tells us all of them condemned him as deserving death, he will mean that Joseph also agreed to the fact that Jesus would die. The trial before the Sanhedrin is about two issues. First, it is about the temple. I will destroy this temple made with hands. And the second is about the Messiah, but not only the Messiah, but whether he as Messiah is the Son of the Blessed One. And so to both these, Jesus says, he doesn't answer the question about the temple, which will be answered later at his death in chapter 15, verse 38. But he answers about the Son of God or the Son of Man. However, even though he's talked about the Messiah, so here there is an identification of the Son of Man with the Messiah. Jesus says, I am. What does Jesus say I am to? He says, I am to the Messiah. And yes, as Messiah, I am the Son of the Blessed One. This is a circumlocution. Instead of using the term God, so it means actually Son of God. This is the only time in the gospel where Jesus accepts that he is Son of God. And we understand now, we can get some insight. When is the time when he accepts the title Son of God? When he is bound, when he is before his accusers, when he is before the religious establishment. And so therefore, as far as Jesus is concerned, now there is no need for any secrecy. There is no need for anyone to say that Jesus is not the Messiah, because the time to conceal is over. I am. This phrase, which means a divine name for God, ego eimi, I am, is also can be read in this particular verse here. The high priest tearing of the clothes is an indication that he considers it as blasphemy. And once again, notice all of them, including Joseph of Arimathea, because the whole council is gathered, condemn him as deserving death. The denials by Peter are very clear as far as Mark is concerned. So he shows Peter denying Jesus, and then Mark will remind us once again about the cock crowing. At that moment, see here, the cock crowed for the second time, because the prediction of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark is that before the cock crows, or rather the cock will not crow twice until you deny me. The third denial of Peter is here. I do not know this man that you are talking about. And then for the second time, the cock crows. We had seen earlier on that it is only the Gospel of Mark which speaks about the cock crowing twice. All the Gospels mention Peter weeping. Luke, however, in chapter 22, verse 62 and 61 and 62, makes the connection between the look of Jesus and the crying or the weeping of Peter. So Peter here remembers. So this memory makes Peter to break down and weep. And we keep in mind that every one of us is also capable of that denial, as we saw also earlier on. Now, this trial before Pilate is a trial in which Pilate does not make any serious attempt. And if we saw the questions before the Sanhedrin were about the temple and about the Son of God, here it is a political question. Are you the King of the Jews? When Jesus responds to Pilate saying, you are the one who says so, he means that he does not really accept that title. He says, I am much more than this title. So you say so. If you want to regard me as king, if you want to give me a political title, that is up to you, but I don't really accept that title. And then when Pilate keeps on questioning Jesus, Jesus refuses to make a reply, as we saw earlier on. If there is openness in a person, then Jesus can respond. But if there is no openness, no matter how much Jesus says, it's not going to be accepted. And because Jesus makes no response, Pilate is amazed. This is a very positive amazement. That means he wonders how Jesus gets his strength to be so calm and collected in this situation. There does not seem to be any other literature about this tradition of releasing a prisoner for them. So whether the evangelists have invented it is not clear. However, the fact that all the three evangelists mention it would seem to indicate that there is a historical core. The point which Mark brings this particular narrative in is because Pilate once again reiterates the title. Notice, as far as Pilate is concerned, the title is not Son of God, the title is King of the Jews. And these, the crowd, have been propped up by the religious authorities and the religious leaders, and then they shout that he be crucified. So then finally, Jesus is handed over to be crucified. The soldiers then mock Jesus, and the cohort actually would have been about 600 soldiers. However, it doesn't seem to be 600, not possible to have 600 soldiers gathering around Jesus, but Mark wants to indicate that everyone is against Jesus. And that is why Mark has got these big numbers. So we saw all the disciples deserted him. The whole council condemned him. Now the whole cohort is gathering. This is Mark's intention. So the purple cloak is also the crown of thorns, is basically to show that they are able to mock Jesus and to show the total helplessness as far as Jesus is concerned. This term, Golgotha, is an Aramaic term and has been translated in a variety of ways. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha. Basically, translated, it means place of the skull. Golgotha is the Aramaic term. Hebrew, you say Golgotha. And in Latin, we say Calvaria. In English, we say the place of the skull. So depending which language you are using, Jesus was crucified based on that particular place. So Golgotha is Hebrew, Golgotha is Aramaic, Calvaria is Latin, and place of the skull is English. The offering of myrrh and wine as a mixture is also seems to indicate that they were mocking Jesus, giving him this delicacy just before he died. And the dividing of the clothes was something which was customary among the soldiers, to take the clothes of those who were condemned and those who were crucified. There are three groups who pass by the cross. The first is the passers-by who derided him. The second is the chief priests along with the scribes, so the religious authorities asking for proof that they would believe if he came down. And notice, there is no good thief in the Gospel of Mark. Even those, both of them who were crucified with him, are the ones who deride him. So it is darkness of basically Jesus is hanging on the cross, and at 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice. That is at 9, the ninth hour, you will say, is the ninth hour with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, and Mark translates that into Greek, because Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani is in Aramaic. Basically, it is a Psalm chapter 22, verse 1. And as far as Jesus is concerned, and far as Mark is concerned, this is abandonment even by God. So the cry on the cross is a total abandonment. And then there are two events which occur at the death of Jesus. The veil of the temple is torn from top to bottom. So we remember the barrier between humans and God is now no more. This is one interpretation. A second interpretation is that God reveals who God is by rending the veil. God is not now behind the veil of the temple. God has abandoned the temple, and some of them see the invitation which Jesus received when the heavens were rent open. Mark uses the same verb, which is schizein, from which we get our English schism. Basically, a schism is when there's a break, when there's a rupture, when there is a tear. That's the meaning of schism. So from schizein, at that time of the baptism, the heavens were schizein, were torn from top to bottom. Here, the veil is torn from top to bottom. So an indication that now true worship is not in the temple, but true worship is on the cross. The second sign, when the centurion saw Jesus breathe his last in this manner. So what exactly impressed the centurion? The manner of death of Jesus possibly, and there are a number of possibilities which scholars give. So one could be the unnatural darkness which occurred. Another could be the last words of Jesus, who was still, even when he is in the throes of death, he is remembering God rather than shouting, as many would have shouted, some profanities. It could be also the last cry which Jesus gives, which is an indication that he is giving himself into the hands of God. In the burial scene, there are women who are looking from a distance, and Mark names them now: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. So these are women who are named. So two Marys, two women named Mary and one Salome. These, Mark tells us, used to follow him. So an indication of the kind of personality which Jesus had, of having and accepting women disciples. We saw earlier on that some interpreted the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 as Jesus being provided bread by women who were supportive of his ministry. This seems to be a confirmation of that. There were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. And what is also ironic is that all the men are missing. Now the women are present. We come to the burial of Jesus, where we are told that Joseph of Arimathea, notice, is a respected member of the council. So very clearly, if the whole council is gathered and if Joseph of Arimathea is a respected member of the council, then it means that he also assented to the death of Jesus. He asks Pilate. Notice only Mark will use this term boldly. Why boldly? Some say the reason why the word boldly is used is because he would have been accused of being on the side of Jesus. My own interpretation of Mark using the word boldly is because Joseph is now willing to accept his mistake. That's why Joseph can be bold, a person who can accept that, yes, I made a mistake. The body of Jesus, the toma, which is the corpse, the translation is the corpse of Jesus is asked, and Pilate learned from the centurion about the death because he was surprised that Jesus had died so soon. He granted the body. So you see, the reason why Mark keeps repeating body, which is corpse, 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 is to indicate that Jesus had died a real death. And the women see where Jesus is buried in order to prepare for what will happen at the tomb. That brings us now to the last part of our discussion on the Gospel of Mark, namely at the tomb. When the Sabbath was over, they had to remain for the Sabbath. So notice Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Joseph is not mentioned here, but we can take for granted. We don't know why Mark is not mentioning Joseph here. And Salome, who were the three women who were looking from afar, they saw where Jesus was buried, and so therefore they are able to go to the tomb. And they go very early on the first day when the sun had risen. So it indicates basically what exactly their intention is. What are they asking? They are asking, who will roll away the stone for us? This is because Mark wants to prepare us for what is going to come. So the three women here are the women who go to the tomb. In the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene is alone. In the Gospel of Matthew, there are two women, of which one is Mary Magdalene. In the Gospel of Luke, there are few women, and one of them is Mary Magdalene. So Mary Magdalene is the only one who is mentioned by all the four evangelists. As a matter of fact, in John chapter 20, verse 1, no other woman is mentioned except Mary Magdalene. So the rising of the sun is possibly an indication that Jesus had already risen. And the question which they ask is also an anticipation of the fact that they will need no one to roll away the stone, because they look up and they see that the stone has already been rolled back. And Mark will remind us, even though people at that time would have known that the stone would be very large, Mark reminds us that this cannot really be something which human beings would have done, because the stone was very large. Of course, it is human beings who would have put the stone in place already, but it would have required at least 4 or 6 men to roll the stone over the tomb. And that's why they're mentioning here it was very large. Once again, Mark is indicating to us that it was divine intervention. So when they enter the tomb, Mark doesn't mention an angelos, but he mentions a neaniskos, a young man who is sitting on the right side. That is the side of authority, the side of power. And they were alarmed. So the alarm conveys that they are shocked to see the situation. They don't know what to make of it. And that's why the man addresses their alarm. And notice, whom are they looking for? In John chapter 20, verses 11 to 18, when Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, first the angels in the tomb who are sitting where the body and head of Jesus, where the feet and head of Jesus lay, first ask the woman a question, or rather they ask a rhetorical question, why are you weeping? Jesus repeats the question later in the Gospel of John, and he says to Mary, Tina Zeteis, which is translated as, whom are you looking for? Here, the young man knows that they are looking for the historical Jesus. The term Jesus of Nazareth is used here to refer to the historical Jesus. But that Jesus is not present. That Jesus has risen, and that is why they will not find that Jesus here. What must they do? They must go and tell his disciples and Peter. Notice the mention of Peter is because, as I said, I will remind you about it again. In chapter 14, verse 28, Jesus said, but after I am raised, I will go before you to Galilee. That's why the young man seems to know everything about Jesus, and that is the reason why some have interpreted the young man as an angel, because he knows so much already. However, Mark does not state that he is an angel. He simply states young man. But just as Jesus had told them in 14:28, he is going before them to Galilee, so the young man reiterates the message of Jesus. So they went. and fled from the tomb for terror and amazement, and they said nothing to anyone. Now the question is, if the gospel ends here, and this is the reason very clearly according to me for the shorter and the longer endings, as we will see in a moment, if the women said nothing to anyone, how did Mark come to know? That is the question. So some think that the ending is now lost, the actual ending is not lost, and that the gospel did not end in 16:8. Others think that the words tell his disciples and Peter that he is with are meant as a rebuke to Peter and the disciples who actually did not believe them. Others think that the silence of the women is a result of being struck with awe at the extraordinary events. And that is why you have a shorter ending. This is the shorter ending. According to this first verse of the shorter ending, the women have gone to the disciples and to Peter and have told them what the young man had said. And in the second verse, the commission of the risen Christ to the 11 disciples, which is actually in the Gospel of Matthew, is presupposed. In the longer ending, which is made up of verses 9 to 20, this is basically what we realize, that some scribes seems to have added it. After he rose early on the first day, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, and Mark will remind us from whom he had cast out 7 demons. That is a fact mentioned only by the Gospel of Luke. So Mark has possibly taken it from there. She went, or rather Mark means the one who added this. She went out and told those who had been with him. So very clearly, it seems clearly here, Mary Magdalene is written about here as if being mentioned for the first time, even though Mark has mentioned her in 1547 and in 16:1. Why did Mark, this surely is not Mark, but why did Mark, if Mark has written this, not tell us first about Mary Magdalene when he mentioned her in 1547 about Jesus casting out 7 demons from her? She went out basically is a reference to John chapter 20 verse 18 after the risen Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. The two of them seems to be a reference to the walk to Emmaus in the Gospel of Luke, and they also went back, but they did not believe them. What we notice is this, is that Jesus is constantly upbraiding the disciples for their lack of stubbornness and faith. So to the credit of the one who has added these verses, we must say that this editor has been faithful to the theme of Mark, which is the lack of faith, the stubbornness, the lack of understanding on the part of the disciples. In chapter 16, verses 17 to 18, the signs that are mentioned here are the signs which are basically mentioned in the Gospel of John and also in the Acts of the Apostles. The ascension, as we know, is mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, and Luke's version of the ascension, both in his Gospel and also in his next work in the Acts of the Apostles. So this longer ending ends very, very positively. The Lord worked with them and confirmed the messages by the signs that accompanied it. At the beginning of our discussion on the gospel, I had said to you that I will speak about the gospel ending at chapter 16, verse 8. And if you see the structure, even though I said the structure in verse 20, I think the gospel ends in chapter 16, verse 8. And the reason why I think this is the case is because Mark is a mystery novel. And he ends with that mystery. To the question, how did Mark come to know? The answer is, if Mark is regarded as the interpreter of Peter, then it is very likely that Peter would have told him. But how did Peter come to know? Peter came to know because the Lord told very clearly Peter when he was alive in Mark 14:28. But after I am raised, the Lord even talks about his resurrection. But after I am raised, I will go before you to Galilee. So Mark knows because Peter has told him. Peter and the disciples know because Jesus has told them. But what Mark wants to show is the women know because the young man has told them. Mark wants his reader to be aware now that he or she also knows. And what does the reader of Mark's gospel know? They know that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is the King of the Jews who gave his body to be broken and his blood to be shed. If you were to ask, when does Jesus become Son of God? My answer would be when he breathes his last, as confirmed by the veil of the temple being torn from top to bottom, an indication that now true worship is on the cross. To the centurion's proclamation, truly, this man was Son of God, and by the title of the cross, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum, Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews. So the longer ending very clearly can be seen to be made up of different verses from different Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. So chapter 16, verse 15, the Great Commission in the Gospel of Matthew, about salvation and judgment in the Gospel of John, speaking in tongues mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, serpents and poison also in the Acts of the Apostles, laying on of hands mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, the ascension mentioned both by Luke in his Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, and verse 20 is a general summary of what is mentioned in Acts. That takes us to the end of the Gospel of Mark and now brings us to the question of the examination.